I didn't say a word when Karen pounded on my window, demanding I move my car out of her spot. She pointed at the painted lines like she owned them, screaming that she'd call the police, the HOA, and anyone else who would listen. I just slid the parking stub across the glass, the one with my name printed clearly on it. "Enjoy your call," I told her. Because what Karen didn't know, not that night in the courthouse garage, not the next day when she filed her complaint, and not when she bragged to her neighbors about how she'd teach me a lesson, was that the courtroom she wanted so badly was my courtroom. And when she walked in on hearing day, expecting some pushover judge to side with her, she found me, black robe and gavel in hand. It started like any other Tuesday. Long docket, endless motions, lawyers arguing over commas and contracts. By the time I stepped out of the courthouse that evening, the sun was low, the Texas sky burning orange, and all I wanted was to sit in my car for 5 quiet minutes before driving home. My spot is tucked near the lower level of the garage. Nothing fancy, just a regular space reserved for courthouse staff, marked with a small plaque that reads, "Judges Use Only." After 20 years on the bench, it's one of the few perks that makes the 12-hour days tolerable. That night, though, someone else thought it belonged to them. She came storming up as soon as I unlocked my door. Mid-50s, blonde bob stiff with hairspray, oversized sunglasses, even though the sun was nearly gone. Pearls tight around her neck, pastel sweater draped across her shoulders like she was auditioning for a country club commercial. Karen. Of course, her name wasn't Karen, but she radiated the type. She slapped the side of my window and shouted, "You're in my spot. Move your car right now." I rolled the window down halfway, calm as a lake on a still morning. "Ma'am, this space is reserved. You can see the plaque." She scoffed. "Reserved for me. I've been parking here for years. Do you even live in this community? Because if you don't, you're trespassing. I'll have you fined." That's when she made her first mistake, she assumed. She assumed I was just another tired man in a suit who'd back down when a loud voice came knocking. I reached into the glove box, pulled out my parking stub, and slid it across the glass. My name, bold print, Judge Michael Carter. She froze for a beat, then sneered. "Never heard of you. Doesn't matter. This is my neighborhood. My HOA runs things here, not you." And there it was, the HOA trump card, the badge of petty tyrants everywhere. She jabbed her finger at me. "If you don't move this car, I'll call the police. I'll sue. You'll regret it." I smiled, a calm, practiced smile. "Then I'll see you in court." She stormed off, heels clicking like gunfire on concrete. She thought that was the end of it, that she'd frightened me off with threats and HOA power. What she didn't realize was that she'd just filed her battle plan straight into the hands of the one man she could never bully. Because the next time she saw me, it wouldn't be in a parking garage. It would be in my courtroom. The next morning, I wasn't surprised to see the envelope on my windshield. Bright red paper, the kind that screams urgent, tucked under the wiper blade like a badge of honor. Violation notice. The words jumped off the page in bold, angry typeface. According to Karen, who'd signed it proudly in looping cursive at the bottom, I was guilty of illegally occupying a community parking space, harassment, and refusal to comply with HOA authority. It would have been laughable, if not for the irony. She had no idea the space belonged to the courthouse, not her HOA. But that's the problem with Karens. They never let facts get in the way of their outrage. Folded the notice neatly and slid it into my briefcase. Evidence. By the time I drove through the subdivision that evening, the whispers had started. A jogger gave me a curious look, slowing just long enough to murmur, "You're the one who parked in Karen's spot?" A young mother standing on her porch shook her head as I passed. "Good luck with her," she muttered under her breath. It was clear Karen had already made her rounds. She told anyone who would listen that I was some outsider trying to trample her authority, a trespasser who thought the rules didn't apply. Classic move. Build a narrative before the truth catches up. What she didn't know was that her trespasser spent his mornings signing arrest warrants and his afternoons presiding over felony trials. 2 nights later, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, Two uniformed officers stood on the porch. "Judge Carter," one asked politely. "Yes, officer. We got a call from the Willow Creek HOA president. She's alleging you've been harassing her and violating parking rules." I almost laughed, but I kept my tone even. "Gentlemen, would you like to see my permit for the courthouse garage?" I handed them the stub. They examined it, nodded, then exchanged a look that said, "This is ridiculous." "Sorry to bother you, sir," the older officer said. "We'll file this as unfounded." As they walked away, I caught sight of Karen lurking at the end of the street, arms crossed, lips pursed in victory, until she realized the officers were shaking their heads. Her smile vanished. Defeat only made her louder. Within a week, I'd received 3 more violation notices. One claimed my lawn was overgrown by half an inch. Another accused me of disrupting community harmony. The last one? Failure to show proper respect to HOA leadership. That one made me chuckle. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And Karen had earned nothing but contempt. Then came the letter. A certified notice in an expensive envelope, complete with HOA letterhead. "Dear Mr. Carter, you are hereby summoned to appear before the Willow Creek HOA board to answer for repeated violations." She wanted a hearing. She wanted to put me on trial. That's when I knew exactly how this would end. The night before her hearing, I stopped by the local diner. Small town place, vinyl booths, the kind where gossip travels faster than coffee. Poor as sure enough, 2 men at the counter were talking about Karen. "She's bragging again," one said. "Says she's got some outsider dead to rights. Claims she'll drag him in front of the board and make him beg." The other chuckled. "She doesn't know who she's dealing with, does she?" I sipped my coffee, hiding a smile. No, she didn't. The morning of the HOA hearing, I dressed like any other day. Crisp black suit, polished shoes, briefcase in hand. I parked in the same courthouse space, my space, and walked past Karen as she stood in front of the boardroom, clipboard. Clutched like a sword, she sneered. "Hope you brought your checkbook," I just smiled. "Hope you brought your best evidence." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Evidence? Please. I am the evidence." That line alone told me everything I needed to know about how this hearing would go. Karen thought her HOA board was the highest court in the land, that her word was law, and her clipboard a gavel. What she didn't realize was that the real gavel, the one that actually mattered, was waiting for her in my courtroom. And when she walked through those doors expecting victory, she'd find justice instead. Karen Whitmore had ruled Willow Creek Estates like a dictator in pearls for over a decade. Nobody moved a trash can, planted a flower bed, or parked a car without her approval. At least, that's what she believed. She patrolled the cul-de-sac like it was her private kingdom, clipboard balanced in one hand, smartphone in the other, ready to snap a photo and fire off a violation notice. The neighbors knew her type all too well. She was the kind of woman who mistook authority for importance, confusing a title on HOA stationery with actual power, and she wielded that illusion like a sword. More than one young family had packed up and moved out after endless harassment from her. If the grass wasn't cut exactly to her standard, fine. If your holiday light stayed up a day too long, fine. She fined a teenager once for washing his car in the driveway because the soap left streaks on the pavement. Parents whispered about her at school drop-offs, and veterans shook their heads when she tried to enforce quiet hours in broad daylight. Karen loved it. She thrived on the fear she created, mistaking silence for respect. What she didn't realize was that most people weren't respecting her. They were enduring her. The subdivision had learned it was easier to roll over than fight, easier to swallow another fine than spend hours arguing with someone who never listened. But not me. I'd dealt with bigger egos in my courtroom. I'd seen men twice her size crumble under the weight of cross-examination, watched high-powered attorneys beg for mercy when their arguments fell apart. Karen's bark might scare a neighbor into repainting a fence, but it didn't move me an inch. She, however, thought she'd found her perfect target. Word spread quickly after she plastered me with violation notices. She told anyone who would listen that I was dangerous to the community, a man with no respect for order. At the diner, she held court at her usual booth, bragging that she'd bring me to my knees in front of the HOA board. She wore her victory in advance, spinning tales about how I was already preparing to sell my house after she was done with me. Her confidence came from years of unchecked power. Nobody had ever challenged her, at least not successfully. And she convinced herself I was no different, just another neighbor who didn't know the rules, just another man who'd fold when faced with the HOA's endless fines and threats. But every empire falls when it grows too arrogant, and Karen's was built on paper-thin authority. The neighbors started to notice cracks in her facade. They saw the police walk away, shaking their heads after she called them on me. They saw the stack of red violation notices grow more absurd with every passing day. They saw her desperation. And for the first time, people whispered not just about her tyranny, but about her weakness. One evening, I walked past Mr. Jenkins, an old Navy man who'd lived in Willow Creek longer than anyone else. He tipped his cap and said quietly, "She's pushing too far this time." It was a small thing, but it mattered. Karen's fear campaign was losing its grip. People who had stayed silent for years were watching closely now, waiting to see how this played out. And Karen, blinded by her own ego, didn't even realize she was fueling the very rebellion that would undo her. I kept my routine simple. Go to work, come home, collect the latest notice and slide it into the growing file in my briefcase. I never raised my voice. I never argued. I gave her nothing to twist into more accusations. Every piece of paper she shoved under my door was another nail in the coffin she was building for herself. And then came the crowning jewel of her campaign, a certified letter, hand-delivered, summoning me to appear at an official HOA tribunal. Karen's signature was scrawled in thick black ink at the bottom, as if she'd signed a royal decree. The hearing, she declared, would determine my future in Willow Creek Estates. I could almost hear the smugness in her words. She believed she'd cornered me, that once I stood before her little board of hand-picked cronies, she'd humiliate me into submission. She was already telling neighbors I'd be fined into bankruptcy, that I'd be forced to move, that she'd protect the neighborhood from people like me. She didn't realize she was walking straight into my world. The courtroom is my battlefield. The law is my weapon. And the one thing Karen had never faced before was someone who knew the rules better than she did. As I stood on my porch that evening, the letter in my hand and the flag fluttering overhead, I couldn't help but smile. She thought the HOA board was the highest authority she'd ever need. She didn't know the real hearing hadn't even started yet. And when it did, she wouldn't be the judge. She'd be the defendant. Karen believed she was untouchable, the queen of her little kingdom with neighbors bowing at her feet. But what she didn't realize was that the same arrogance that made her powerful was the arrogance that would destroy her. Because the next time she tried to put me on trial, she wouldn't be standing above me. She'd be standing below, staring, up at the bench where I sat in black robes. The night of the HOA hearing felt like theater. Karen had orchestrated every detail as though she were the star of some courtroom drama. The clubhouse, usually used for potlucks and summer meetings, had been transformed into her personal throne room. Folding chairs lined up in stiff rows, neighbors reluctantly filing in, unsure if they were there to watch a trial or a spectacle. At the front, a long plastic table draped with a faded cloth served as the bench, and behind it sat Karen and her loyal board members, 3 retirees who owed her more favors than they cared to admit. I walked in quietly, briefcase in hand, the weight of months of her accusations neatly organized inside. Karen's eyes lit up as soon as she saw me, that smug little smile spreading across her face like she'd already won. She tapped her pen against the table, called the room to order, and launched into her speech. "Neighbors," she began, her voice syrupy but sharp, "we are gathered here tonight to address repeated violations of our community standards. This man," she pointed at me dramatically, "has shown blatant disregard for the rules that keep Willow Creek beautiful and safe. He has harassed leadership, refused compliance, and endangered the harmony of our neighborhood. Tonight, the board will decide appropriate sanctions." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded along. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. I caught the eye of Mr. Jenkins, the Navy vet, sitting in the back. He gave me the slightest nod as if to say, "Steady now, let her talk," and so I did. I let her talk. Karen droned on for 20 minutes, reading every violation notice she had ever taped to my door, waving the papers in the air like they were sacred texts. She painted me as a menace, a lawbreaker, a man bent on tearing down her carefully curated paradise. With every word she grew bolder, her voice rising, her gestures wild. Finally, she turned to me with a dramatic flourish. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything to say in your defense?" The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned my way. I stood slowly, set my briefcase on the table, and clicked it open. "Only this," I said calmly. "Every single notice you've issued me is invalid." Gasps. Karen's face twitched, a mix of rage and disbelief. I pulled out the first document. My courthouse parking permit, issued by the county itself, granting me the right to park in that space. I laid it flat on the table for everyone to see. Karen claimed I was trespassing in a private HOA spot. In reality, this space is reserved by the county for courthouse staff. Her claim was not only false, but laughably uninformed. I pulled out the next stack, photos of my yard, time-stamped and trimmed to perfection, refuting her accusations of overgrown grass. Then came the letters from the sheriff's department, dismissing her harassment claims as unfounded. Then copies of state statutes highlighting protections against arbitrary HOA enforcement. One by one, I laid them down like playing cards, each one cutting deeper into her facade. The room shifted. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering to each other. The board members exchanged nervous glances. Karen's smile was gone. Her knuckles whitened around her pen. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "You can't just—" I held up a hand, calm but firm. "Karen, you've accused me of breaking rules. But here's the truth. You've abused your authority. You've harassed me with baseless fines, called police on false pretenses, and misrepresented your power as HOA president. What you've done isn't leadership. It's bullying." A ripple of applause broke out in the back. Karen whipped around, glaring at the neighbors, but the momentum had shifted. For the first time, people weren't afraid to speak up. Mr. Whitaker, the Korean war vet, raised his voice. "He's right. You've been pulling this nonsense for years, Karen. It's about time someone stood up to you." Others chimed in, complaints about her petty fines, her late-night patrols, her endless nitpicking. The dam had burst, and Karen was drowning in the flood of resentment she'd spent a decade building. She slammed her fist on the table, desperate to regain control. "Enough! This is my hearing, and I will not be disrespected." But that's when I pulled out the final card. The letter. It was from the county courthouse, on official stationery, confirming my position as a sitting judge in the district court. I laid it on the table slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of the title sink in. "You wanted a hearing, Karen," I said, my voice steady as a gavel strike. "Be careful what you wish for, because hearings are my business." The room went dead silent. Karen stared at the letter as though it were a snake poised to strike. Her lips parted, but no words came out. For once, the queen of the cul-de-sac had nothing to say. I gathered my papers calmly, slid them back into my briefcase, and snapped it shut. "This tribunal is over," I said. "And next time, Karen, choose your battles more wisely." The neighbors erupted, some laughing, some clapping, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen stood frozen behind her table, her power crumbling with every cheer. I walked out without another word. Karen thought the HOA tribunal was her stage, her chance to humiliate me in front of the neighborhood. But what she didn't realize was that the show had just begun, because in a few short weeks, she'd be standing in a real courtroom, facing consequences she never imagined. And this time, she wouldn't be behind the table, she'd be standing before the bench. The courthouse was buzzing that morning, though not for any high-profile case or breaking trial. No, the whispers in the hallway were about Karen. Word travels fast in small towns, and her arrogance had made sure everyone knew. She was bringing her case against me before a judge. She arrived in a cloud of perfume and entitlement, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. pearls rattling against her chest as she strutted past the security checkpoint. Karen loved the spotlight. She basked in it like a cat in the sun, smiling smugly at the clerks, announcing to anyone within earshot that today she would finally teach that man a lesson. She didn't know the lesson wasn't for me, it was for her. I was already in chambers, reviewing files when the bailiff gave me the nod. The docket was stacked as always, a full day of hearings, but I'd saved her little complaint for mid-morning. By then, the gallery would be full enough to give her an audience, but not so full as to delay justice. When I finally walked into the courtroom, the shuffle of bodies, the scrape of benches, and the low murmur of voices all faded to silence. I took my seat at the bench, robe flowing, gavel resting in my hand. My eyes swept the room until they landed on her. Karen froze. Her confident smirk faltered the moment recognition hit her. The man she thought she'd dragged through the mud, the trespasser she'd threatened and mocked, the one she'd plastered with violation notices, was sitting above her, elevated on the bench, the black robe draped across his shoulders like armor. "Ms. Whitmore," I said, my voice steady and formal, "you've brought forth a complaint. Proceed." Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Your Honor," she stammered, "there must be some mistake. You can't possibly—" "Proceed," I repeated, tapping the gavel lightly. She fumbled through her notes, reading her accusations in a trembling voice that grew shriller with every word. "He parked illegally. He harassed me. He violated HOA bylaws. He—" She trailed off, her eyes darting back to my robe as though it might swallow her whole. When she finally sputtered to silence, I leaned forward. "Ms. Whitmore, do you have any evidence that I violated the law?" Her face flushed crimson. "The HOA rules are law," she snapped, desperate to regain ground. "The HOA's authority extends only as far as the bylaws allow," I said evenly. "And as you've been told repeatedly, the parking space in question is county property, reserved for courthouse personnel. Your notices were baseless. Your police reports were unfounded. Your tribunal was theater, nothing more," the gallery murmured. Karen's hands shook as she shuffled her papers, searching for anything that could save her. But there was nothing. The truth had stripped her bare. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice cutting through the room, "your repeated harassment, false claims, and misuse of authority constitute an abuse of your position as HOA president." Her knees buckled. She gripped the table to steady herself. "I hereby dismiss this complaint with prejudice," I said, raising the gavel. "And I strongly suggest that the Willow Creek HOA review its leadership and consider whether Ms. Whitmore is fit to continue serving in any capacity." The gavel struck. The sound cracked like thunder. Karen flinched as though it had struck her personally. Around the room, neighbors exchanged glances, some smiling, some openly grinning. The bailiff banged his baton for order, but the energy was electric. The queen had fallen. Karen gathered her papers in silence, her hands trembling, her face pale. She avoided every eye in the room, slinking toward the exit like a cat caught in the rain. The same neighbors she once terrorized with fines and threats now whispered behind her back, their fear replaced with laughter. I sat in my chair, the gavel, resting quietly on the bench, and let the moment settle. Justice wasn't always dramatic, but sometimes it was poetic. And this, watching Karen walk out of my courtroom, stripped of power, humiliated by the very system she tried to twist, was as poetic as it got. When the sound of the gavel faded, so did the last of Karen Whitmore's power. She walked out of that courtroom in silence, shoulders hunched, her pearls rattling not with authority but with fear. For years she had strutted through Willow Creek Estates like a queen, but that morning she left looking more like an exile. The neighborhood felt it immediately. That same evening, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into action. At the clubhouse, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting without her. The men who once nodded along to her orders suddenly found their spines, each one acknowledging what the whole community had known for years, but never said aloud. Karen's reign had gone too far. By the end of the week, a letter circulated. Effective. Immediately, Karen Whitmore is removed as president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association pending a formal election. Neighbors gathered in small groups on porches, some laughing, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They weren't just relieved. They were liberated. For the first time in a long time, kids played basketball in driveways without mothers peeking nervously through curtains. Lawns weren't inspected with rulers. Trash cans rolled out when they needed to, not when Karen's schedule allowed. It was as though the whole subdivision exhaled after holding its breath for years. I watched it all from my porch, sipping coffee as the flag swayed gently in the breeze. For months, I had endured her threats, her notices, her desperate power plays. But now, the silence was sweet. Karen never came to apologize. That wasn't in her nature. Pride like hers doesn't bend, it only breaks. Some said she packed her bags and moved in with her daughter 2 towns over, unable to face the whispers that followed her every time she stepped outside. Others said she still lived in the subdivision but never showed her face. At meetings again, the queen dethroned and forgotten. It didn't matter. Her absence was enough. The throne she'd built out of fear sat empty, and no one rushed to fill it. Weeks later, Mr. Jenkins, the Navy vet, hosted a cookout in his backyard. It was the first community gathering anyone could remember without Karen hovering nearby with a clipboard. The laughter was louder, the food tasted better, and the kids ran free until the sun dipped low. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Jenkins said, handing me a plate of ribs. "It feels right," I replied. The truth was, Willow Creek didn't need a tyrant to enforce harmony. All it needed was neighbors who respected one another, who understood that a community isn't built on rules scribbled in fine print but on trust and kindness. Karen had never understood that, and it was why she had fallen so hard. Late one night, I sat alone on the porch, watching the quiet street glow under the lamplight. The same driveway where Karen once screamed at me in broad daylight now sat, still, peaceful. The courthouse garage plaque, judges use only, gleamed faintly under the streetlight, untouchable now that the truth was out. I thought about the irony of it all. Karen believed the HOA bylaws were law itself. She believed fear was respect. She believed her word was unshakable. But real power doesn't come from fear. Real authority doesn't come from bullying. It comes from truth, and from the courage to stand your ground even when it's easier to stay quiet. That was the lesson I hoped the neighborhood carried forward. In the end, Karen taught us something, though not the lesson she intended. She showed us how fragile a kingdom built on intimidation really is. One push, one refusal to bend, and it crumbles. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Bullies only thrive in silence. The moment someone speaks, the spell breaks. Karen wanted to drag me into a hearing, humiliate me, and drive me out of the neighborhood. Instead, she was the one driven out. She wanted to prove her power. Instead, she proved her weakness. And that's the story of how an HOA Karen tried to take my parking spot, only to discover I was the judge at her own hearing. Have you ever dealt with a Karen, an HOA tyrant, or a neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to them? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next takedown. Because trust me, the next one is even crazier.